This podcast is part of the Batman Universe Podcast Network, hosted by the BatmanUniverse.net. Check out everything related to Batman and the entire Bat family at the BatmanUniverse.net, including news and original content related to comics, movies, television, merchandise, video games, and more. Also, check out some of the other unique podcasts that TBU has to offer. Consider supporting this podcast by becoming a patron on Patreon. Even $1 can go a long way in supporting this content that you enjoy. Look for a link over at the BatmanUniverse.net to offer your support now. And now, on with the show.
In 2008, a podcast was created with one goal: to bring Bat fans around the world news related to movies, comics, video games, television, merchandise, and so much more. And now, the Batman Universe Podcast has returned.
Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of the TBU Podcast. I am Dustin, BJ, and Hannan are with me today, and we are discussing Batman and Spider-Man, the two biggest characters that grace the Big Two comic companies. Arguably, Batman is, I'm sure there is some people who will claim it's not, but let's be honest, Batman is the top character when it comes to DC Comics, and Spider-Man is by far the top character when it comes to Marvel Comics. And this is true of pretty much everything that comes out. When it comes to comics, Batman and Spider-Man are the leaders when it comes to comic sales. When it comes to the movies, the Spider-Man and Batman movies have by far done an insane amount of money. Obviously, there's been more Marvel movies as a whole, but individually, when you look at the character films, not like the Avengers type films where they're all together, Spider-Man still outperforms, Batman still outperforms all the other individual characters because they just are that popular. In addition to that, when you look at merchandise, man, oh man, is there a lot of merchandise for both of these characters. They're really, and by far, these characters are also complete polar opposites. One works at night, one works during the day. One is your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and one is the guy who sits on a gargoyle at night scaring the crap out of you. I mean, it's just how it goes. So this is a unique time. Obviously, those of you who are hearing this podcast, you're probably thinking to yourself, what odd timing of this? No, it's obviously not odd timing. We planned this perfectly because there's a new Spider-Man movie that, in my opinion, is going to it will be the first film of after the pandemic to put out and come out and make $1 billion. And hopefully Batman comes out in March, and that's the second one. But Spider-Man is by far kind of like the gateway to the movies getting back to normal, in my opinion, because there's a lot of hype surrounding this film. There's a lot of people who are really looking forward to this for a variety of different reasons, and I'm not going to get into it because obviously we are a Batman podcast, not a Spider-Man podcast. There are plenty of other Spider-Man podcasts out there that you should check out, but we are here today specifically to kind of cross-promote with Spider-Man, but specifically ride that wave of Spider-Man traffic, and that's what we're here for. So we are going to be discussing two very interesting comics, because when you talk about Batman and Spider-Man, it's very difficult to talk about those two characters and not lead into something that they actually dealt with together. There's no movies that they're ever going to appear in together. There's not a lot of other types of content or media or merchandise that legally, at least, these two characters both appeared in. So there was two specific comic series or comic one-shots, I should say, or graphic novels that released in the 90s. The first one was entitled Spider-Man and Batman Disordered Minds. And I will say that subtitle, Disordered Minds, when I was younger and I found these comics about 10 years ago, or longer than 10 years ago, but when I found these comics, and there was no Disordered Minds, it's not something you see on the cover. It is inside of the book, but that is that. So I'm going to read a quick plot synopsis of this, and then we're going to talk about what we thought of the issue itself. So the plot goes, the Joker and Carnage meet when behavioral psychiatrist Cassandra Breyer attempts to use the two killers as tests for a chip that will lobotomize their homicidal instincts. The Carnage symbiote neutralizes Cassidy's chip after it's implanted, with Cassidy pretending that the chip had worked so that he could meet the Joker. After Carnage removes the Joker's chip, the two's mutual psychosis lead them into a brief alliance before their differing methods of murder cause a clash. The Joker tries to kill Carnage with a bomb, but Carnage drapes a piece of symbiote over a corpse to fake his death. Batman and Spider-Man uncover the trick, and Batman is subsequently engulfed in Carnage's symbiote tendrils. Carnage proposes to kill Batman, but the Joker threatens to set off a bomb to destroy Gotham, himself, and Carnage, rather than see Carnage kill Batman. As Batman battles Carnage, Spider-Man follows the Joker. The Joker defiantly dares Spider-Man to kill him, however, and Spider-Man is unable to stoop to his level, electing to apprehend the Joker in classic superhero style. This comic was specifically written by J.M. DeMatteis, and the art was done by Mark Bagley. At the time, this one was produced, or was actually distributed by Marvel Comics, and then a couple years later, the other one was actually distributed by DC Comics. It seems like they were going back and forth in a lot of the crossovers that existed at this time period. There was one where one character had the first name in the title, and then they swapped to the other side when the other publishing company was doing it as well. The art by Mark Bagley, I know very little about Spider-Man comics, but I do know that Mark Bagley was huge with Spider-Man comics during this time frame, and I know this because when Mark at some point Mark Bagley came over to DC Comics, and there was a big deal made by fellow TBU staffers Joshua Lappin-Bertoni and Donovan Grant about how Mark Bagley was best known for Spider-Man comics. So that's honestly the only reason I know his name. DeMatteis, he's been involved in Marvel and DC stuff. He's not an unknown character by any means. But they purposely got this project because of their connections with Spider-Man, and obviously producing types of stories that a lot of people could get behind and accept. So what did you guys think of this comic?
So I've never read this issue of the two issues that we're talking about tonight until this week, and I always heard about it, and I knew that Bagley drew it, and Bagley's probably my favorite Spider-Man artist growing up. I remember he did a lot in Maximum Carnage, so it was perfect that he drew this Carnage story. So yeah, I really liked it. I mean, it was kind of cookie cutter, or to say the least, but it kind of, I didn't mind the story because I just wanted to see Batman and Spider-Man take on Carnage and the Joker, and you think as a kid, you think that would never happen, only in like your living room or your bedroom when you're playing with your action figures. To finally read that story and see Batman punch Carnage and Spider-Man beat up the Joker. But so I liked it. It was more, the story was a middle of the road story, but I really just wanted to see that action.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. To your point, I did think it was a little, like you said, cookie cutter or predictable. You know, nothing. I don't think it was anything phenomenal, but it was fun and entertaining. And I don't know a lot about Spider-Man. I've seen the live action movies, and I've watched some of the cartoon shows. So I know very little about him in the comics, but I liked the pairing of the characters together. And I thought the art was fun. It definitely gave me that feel of, oh yeah, comics from a little while ago. It just kind of had that vibe to it. So overall, I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun.
Yeah, cookie cutter is probably the best way I would describe it as well. The thing that the only thing I have to, I guess, complain about is if you have Batman and Joker, that makes sense. You're going to have this crossover. You take Batman and his top tier, top of the line villain, and you put it as Joker. That makes sense. On the Spider-Man side, however, I'm not sure that I know Carnage was extremely popular at this time period for when this comic came out. I don't know that I would have immediately chose Carnage. The fact that they kind of linked the fact that they're both murderers, they're both psychos, and that's kind of how they made that connection between them. I mean, it's obviously there. I can't speak to Carnage in the comics. Obviously, Carnage was recently in Venom 2, so I know a little bit about Carnage, at least from how he showed up there. And he was a psycho, but I don't know that it's the same psycho as Joker, at least based off of what I've seen. What I would have liked to see is if you take the top tier villain from Batman and you're going to put him in here, then I think they should have got the top tier villain from Spider-Man, which in my opinion is Green Goblin. I don't know that that's actually true. I have always assumed that Green Goblin is like the Joker, the Joker level villain for Spider-Man. So I would have liked to see that, mostly because it would have created a different type of story instead of just having like the whole subplot of this psychiatrist coming up with a chip that's going to make everybody no longer homicidal. That seemed completely unnecessary. It didn't seem like it was really doing anything. I like to see it when they have crossovers, whether it be, let's say, Batman and Superman, and then you've got Lex Luthor and Joker. Those two are so polar opposites, but you have to see how they interact with each other, how they would even want to work with each other. Why in the world would Lex ever want to work with somebody like the Joker? And I think that could have made it a little bit more interesting. But then again, you're looking at a comic that came out at this point 26 years ago, and it makes sense that it wasn't necessarily some amazing type of literature that people are going to remember for ages upon ages. So there's that.
I did like they was like how Carnage and Joker are going to team up, but then Joker breaks that partnership because there's no showmanship in the way that Carnage wants to kill people. He just wants to mass murder everybody, while Joker wants to put on a show for everybody, and he won't let. And it is very true to the Joker where he won't let anyone touch Batman except for him. So I did like how Joker ended up turning on Carnage a little.
Yep.
Yeah, I actually liked the weird subplot with the chips and the brains and whatnot. I thought it was interesting because it kind of gave the sense that they were touching upon a little bit of like a moral issue, and they even mention it in the comic where the scientist is accused, and they're like, aren't you just hiding tyranny under another form of fascism? So I thought that was actually kind of interesting, and I like it when those concepts are played around with in comics because, I mean, practically speaking, there's so much to debate in the terms of morals and ethics in this world. So I thought that was neat, and it was actually funny because I had forgotten up until this point that Carnage was a Spider-Man villain. I was thinking Venom because I've seen the film, and I was like, oh, wait. And I thought they paired well together. And I don't know too much about Green Goblin, but I think in this case there's enough chaos from both Carnage and Joker to kind of lend itself to the story and create the story the way it was. I wonder if that would be the case if that was the villain that they used, but to be honest with you, I don't know enough about Spider-Man to really speak on that, I think.
All right, so then jump forward 2 years. We're now in 1997, and there is a new book that's coming out called Batman and Spider-Man New Age Dawning. Now, this one, again, was written by J.M. DeMatteis, and the penciler for this one was Graham Nolan. Graham Nolan is very well known within the Batman community because he produced an insane amount of work alongside Chuck Dixon in the 90s. And he even had a recent Bane Conquest series that he worked on with Chuck Dixon just in the last couple of years as well. So so they went to the other side of the pot in that regard to get someone from the DC camp. This one, however, was in fact done. This one, it's interesting because as I'm looking at the Wikipedia entry, it claims that the publisher for this one was Marvel Comics. When you look online at the fandom pages, this one was on the DC fandom, the fandom wiki site, while the Spider-Man and Batman one that we just talked about, that one was on the Marvel one. So it's a toss-up. We'll just leave it at that. So this one specifically is it's not a direct sequel necessarily, but this one obviously takes place in the same universe as the first one. Ra's al Ghul begins plans for worldwide devastation. He manipulates the Kingpin to his side by infecting the crime lord's wife, Vanessa Fisk, with cancer, promising him the cure in return for his allegiance. Roz then orders him to press the button on his machines, which would send New York City under the ocean. Ultimately, Spider-Man and Batman interfere, and the Kingpin reveals that he knows Roz's plan and allows the two heroes to board his plane so they can assist him. Defeated, Roz bows out of the plane gracefully, but claims that there is no cure for the cancer. Vanessa convinces her husband that she wishes no further violence, and they leave. Talia al Ghul soon gives the cure to Batman, who then gives it to Spider-Man, who passes it on to the Kingpin. So, again, this is a very simple story. What did you guys think?
Well, this one was, I read this as a kid, so little 10-year-old BJ Shea remembers this story very fondly. This took me back to when I was 10 reading it. So this is, I like this one a lot. I love the art by Graham Nolan, and such a great artist on DC. So he's one of the first kind of Batman like that I recognized way from when I was a kid. No, I like this art. So I like this. When I read it with Kevin Conroy's voice in my head, and I forget the actor Spider-Man in the 90s cartoon, because this was at the height of both those animated shows. So I hear their voice, I hear the Kingpin voice, I hear the Ra's al Ghul voice. So I really like this one.
Yeah, I have similar thoughts to the first issue. It was fun and interesting, and felt a little bit more like more like a Batman comic, maybe, just because Ra's al Ghul was kind of like the mastermind, and then Talia gets involved, and for whatever reason, my brain was like, it just felt more like a Batman comic with those characters and the plot overall. So that was neat, and I liked the parallels between the characters and the similarities that both Batman and Spider-Man have, and the differences that they have, and how that's played with. I think there's some good banter there, and I think I don't know, I think Talia is such a difficult character to do well, perhaps, or sometimes when you read her, sometimes it frustrates me the way in which she's portrayed, So
I would say with this one, I was kind of surprised by the way Kingpin was portrayed, mostly because everything I know about Kingpin, he's very ruthless. He's not one to have one put over on him. And this did not obviously come across like that. I thought that the Ra's elements made sense. It was nice to see the ending take place the way it did, where Talia, conveniently gets on Batman's good graces by giving him the cure, and then Spider-Man can pass it off to Kingpin, leading Kingpin to kind of like owe Spider-Man one, or at least make him even for helping the heroes take down Ra's and earlier. But I like this one better, and I think it's probably because of Graham Nolan's art. I loved Graham Nolan's art because when I started reading comics, Graham Nolan was he was all over the place with doing different comics that I was reading. So I appreciated this one a little bit better. But like I said, it's mostly because of the art. I did enjoy the pairing of Ra's and Kingpin more so than the Carnage and Joker. But I think, like we said for the first one, it's kind of the same thing. They weren't necessarily looking at creating some sort of like perfect comic or amazing thing that's going to win awards or anything like that. It was just, we have the opportunity to tell a story with these characters. Let's do something that kind of lends it to normal comic stories, but involves characters from both sides of the universes. And let's do something that will, potentially sell a boatload of comics, because let's be honest, that's what the whole idea of all these crossovers was to do, which was let's make a boatload of money for both companies.
One thing I like to say about both these is that I like how it's just they're the same universe. There's no like Spider-Man jumps through a portal or a time machine, all of a sudden ends up in Gotham. You just open the page, they're both in the same universe. Batman's referencing Maximum Carnage. Carnage heard about the Joker. Ra's and Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, they're in cahoots together. They know each other's different operations. So that's one thing I really enjoyed about both these issues. Another thing was the banter between Batman and Spider-Man, especially in the second one, was a lot better than the first, where Spidey's cracking at Batman, how he's humorless and doesn't really tell jokes, and it's just, it's fun to see two characters talk to each other.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting on both those points. When I first opened it, I was definitely expecting the intro to be like, some character falls through some portal, ends up in another world, and so on and so forth. And I actually had to scroll back up to the top and be like, wait, did I miss something? Because they just dove right into it. And I was like, oh, no, never mind. It's just like, that's just the world they live in. And I totally agree with you. The comedy potential was a lot better handled, I think, in the second than in the first. Because, I mean, with those two characters, there's a lot you could do with it. It kind of gave me a little bit of the sense of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Batman comic crossover, if you guys have read that or seen the movie.
Yep.
That was kind of the vibe that I got with that one a little bit more.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what BJ was referencing by the portal, because that's exactly how all the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle Batman crossovers existed. Was there was a portal or a time warp or some sort of dimensional rift or something like that. And those were great. And, who's to say that we won't be doing Batman Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the future if there's a new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie. Batman's crossed over with a lot of characters, probably more characters than the comic, the general fan would probably even be aware of. But yeah, so these were two interesting things. They're very much placed in that time frame of 1990s. That is absolutely true. The art style, both Graham Nolan and Bagley are very much 90s artists. It's not to say, obviously, they didn't work outside the 90s, but their art is some of the art that is best known. Mark Bagley's art is even to this day, when you see Spider-Man depictions, you go to Universal Studios, for example, and you are looking at the Spider-Man ride, a lot of the art that you're seeing is Mark Bagley Spider-Man stuff. It's synonymous with the name. And in the 90s, Graham Nolan's Batman was synonymous with the character. So it's very much taking place at that time. But let's get forward to the present time. And if you were to pair, because obviously I'm not looking for necessarily story elements, but if you had, if the stars aligned correctly and Marvel and DC decided, we're going to take another crack at doing some crossovers. The comic industry is dying and we're going to bring it back to life by crossing over our characters, which, let's be honest, there's a lot more parent companies involved nowadays where I don't see that happening. But if it did, what character would you pair with Batman and what character would you pair with Spider-Man? So what two villains would you have basically either team up or face off against each other within a Batman Spider-Man comic in the present day?
So I was thinking, when you posed this question on the show notes, I didn't really think about the villains, but I was thinking, because back in the 90s, Spider-Man was really just a solo character. And now he's blown up to where there's a Spider-Verse and there's multiple Spider-Men. So I was thinking almost kind of like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle crossovers we talked about, where it's Batman, Robin, Batgirl, and they kind of team up with Spider-Man, Miles Morales, Spider-Man, and Spider-Gwen. You could kind of get different pairings from that. I really haven't thought about what villains they could fight. Probably just maybe a Sinister Six and a Legion of Doom or something team up, and they all six of those characters, all six of our heroes have to take on those bad guys. But that's where I would like to see maybe like Spider-Man and Damian team up, or Spider-Man, or maybe it's Dick Grayson, Robin, and Girl and Spider-Gwen could team up. I think you get a lot of cool pairings like you did in the Ninja Turtles animated movie, where you got the different pairings of Michelangelo, Damian, Girl, Donatello, certain things like that. So you could split those guys off into really cool stories, cool interactions.
Darn it, BJ, you kind of took my answer. It's definitely similar of an idea, but I think it would be fun to see the teams, because even as I was reading the comics, I was like, oh, how would this be different if like Robin was here, or if the other characters that Spider-Man is associated with were here. I was thinking more along the lines of like Batgirl and like Stephanie and Cass and the girls kind of getting involved, and then seeing how you could play that with the other female heroes from Spider-Man's verse. But again, I'm not super familiar with them. I know there's like or there's Gwen, right? And then MJ even. But even in this comic, she was in there. And so it's like, how could you get her involved? Kind of how can you have that showcased a little bit more? But yeah, just the other Batman characters kind of mixing with the other Spider-Man characters. And in terms of villains, gosh, there are a lot of good ones that I can think of in terms of like DC, but I know only like the more popular ones from Spider-Man. Man, I'm trying to think. Come back to me on that one. Let me like think again about it. What about you, Dustin?
Well, I was thinking, I like the idea of the larger universe, like BJ was saying, with the Bat family members and the Spider-Verse characters and all of that. But I was thinking on the lines of the villains, Spider-Man has got the Sinister Six. If you're going to go, crazy and you're going to tell something that's going to be top tier story, why not just have the Sinister Six and have like the classic group of Batman villains? So like Catwoman, Joker, Penguin, Riddler, and you can even like that. Those were the four, obviously, that are the most popular ones from the 60s series, the most well known ones. But you could also throw in Two-Face, and you could round it out with, you could throw in Poison Ivy. And then you've got like a really good group of villains that could face off. And it doesn't necessarily, I think it would be even more interesting, not necessarily the villains teaming up and the heroes teaming up. I think it'd be more interesting if the villains were facing each other for some reason. And then as a third team, you've got the Spider-Man characters and the Batman characters that kind of have to like join forces. So you've got a whole like group of 12 villains amongst the two universes that have to they're going against each other for some purpose. They, and the heroes are kind of on the outside looking in, going, do we just let them take each other out themselves, or maybe we should stop this? And I think that would be a really interesting thing to do, because it's, I think it's, I hate to say this, but I think it's a cop out when you just have villains teaming up. I feel like either somebody's going to end up betraying the other one, or they're not going to get along, and that's always ultimately their downfall. So if you have them facing off against each other from the get-go, you don't have to worry about that easy out. You have to create a better story that makes better sense, and I think that's what I would go with.
Yeah, that's neat. Wait, remind me, who's on the Sinister Six again?
Well, it changes, but Doc Ock, Electro, Mysterio, Rhino, Vulture, and Green Goblin, right? I think so.
Sandman,
yes, yeah.
He's usually a constant one. There's been so many incarnations of the Sinister Six. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's almost like the Sinister Six is like a title, and then it's like pick and choose which ones you want to put in the six.
Yeah, kind of like in the Injustice League.
Yeah, I think Doc Ock is one of like the mainstays in most of the incarnations, but yeah,
Ock's always he's always the leader of it. And yeah.
All right. Well, before we end our Spider-Man talk, BJ actually has a article coming up on the site, or not. It is, while this podcast is released, it is live on the site, so definitely check this out. But BJ, what can fans expect to find in your Batman vs. Spider-Man article?
This one was a really fun one to write, because as much of a Batman fan I am, I'm equally a Spider-Man fan, and I kind of go back and forth. Like right now, I'm on like a huge Spider-Man kick with the movie coming out, and just writing this article. Kind of went back to my old Spider-Man comics and was reading those, and the article kind of just comparing the two characters, how they are very different, but they are very similar. They have similar origins. Both come from tragedy. Both handle it differently. They both have a lot of tech. Batman has batarangs. Spider-Man has the web shooters. They both a lot of love interests. They both have Peter obviously has Mary Jane and Gwen, and Batman has Catwoman, Silver St. Cloud. Of course, they have just talked about it. With the villains, they have probably the two most famous rogues galleries in all of comics. And it's probably the most famous comic book characters of all time. There's a reason that there's been so many movies and merchandise and animated shows of these two characters. So it was really fun to just write and compare each one. And maybe one has slightly more, I kind of gave the edge either way without really picking a main winner, because you can't really pick between Batman and Spider-Man. But maybe lean towards Batman, because this is the Batman universe. So
let's hope so. So definitely check that out. As you're reading this, it will be popping up, or as you're listening, I should say, as you're listening to this podcast, the article should be front and center up there on the top of the website. So definitely take a look at that. I encourage everyone to support the competition and go check out Spider-Man this weekend. I'm going on Thursday evening, or Thursday afternoon, actually, to go see it with two of my friends. And then I'll be taking my two oldest kids to see it over the weekend as well. So I'm going to be seeing it twice. I've already heard positive things. I'm staying away from the spoilers because I hate spoilers. But I've heard good things, and a lot of people have said really good things about it. And honestly, I love when comic movies come out. Before I started TBU and before I really dove into Batman as my like top tier character, I loved all superheroes. That's how it was. And when the early 2000s were going on and I was in high school, I was obsessed with superhero movies. That was my thing. I read comics and things, but I loved the fact that the X-Men movies were coming out, the Spider-Man movies were coming out. There already was obviously Batman movies. It was a great time, and the Spider-Man movies, the Sam Raimi movies, were like a great way for things to adapt into really telling good stories that were really true to the comics, and I appreciate that. And now here we are, almost 2 decades later, and we're getting the culmination of 3 different Spider-Man movie franchises over the course of these 2 decades, and I can't wait. So, I'm a Batman fan first and foremost, but I love superhero movies. I will always go see them, and this is one that I've been looking forward to for quite some time. So definitely check it out. And support the films, because we all know that when Batman comes around, Spider-Man fans are going to go see that too. So definitely do that. All right. So before we wrap up the episode, we have a quick news brief. And this was kind of last second because we're recording this episode just a couple days later than we typically would because I was out of town. But there was something that popped up on December 13th that definitely warrants at least a brief discussion because there's not a whole lot here. But the headline reads, Batwoman team to develop Gotham Knights series at CW. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, ooh, another Batman show on the CW, or a Batman Universe show, I should say, on the CW. Now, whether your opinions on the Batwoman series, put those to the side, because that's not what we're here to talk about. The people who are behind the series are creating a new series. And that Gotham Knights line is a little misleading because you're probably thinking to yourself, is this going to be similar to the new video game that's coming out that happens to be also called Gotham Knights? Could it be focusing on the other heroes within Gotham City, like Nightwing and Robin and Batgirl? Are we going to get, is it kind of like a continuation or an expansion of what we're currently seeing with the Batwoman TV series on the CW? And I would say, no, it is not. And I have some immediate thoughts, but I'm going to read the description of what the show is because I think this is extremely important. In the show, in the wake of Bruce Wayne's murder, his rebellious adopted son forges an unlikely alliance with the children of Batman's enemies when they are all framed for killing the Caped Crusader. And as the city's most wanted criminals, this renegade band of misfits must fight to clear their names. But in Gotham, with no Dark Knight to protect it, the city descends into the most dangerous it's ever been. However, hope comes from the most unexpected of places, as this team of mismasked fugitives will become its next generation of saviors, known as the Gotham Knights. So, in a world of having a Batwoman series, a Titan series is currently having Robin and Nightwing and Oracle, or a version of Oracle, and having characters like Batgirl getting a film, all of the Bat family characters appearing in the upcoming video game called Gotham Knights. They've decided that they're going to go completely off kilter and create an original idea using characters from the Batman universe as inspiration, because Bruce Wayne's dead and his adopted son. So I'm guessing, at least from the description, the adopted son could or may or may not be Red Hood, but I would assume it's Red Hood based off of that description. His rebellious adopted son forms an unlikely alliance with other criminals' children. I'm starting to get like this weird idea of what they tried to do with like Birds of Prey, and also similar to one of the main criticisms behind the Batwoman series, which is when you have a Batman series that doesn't have Batman, it's very difficult to tell the story unless the other characters are they have a group of fans behind them. This is not going to have that. And while it could definitely work, this is like taking the idea of what Gotham was and just setting it after Batman instead of before Batman. You're still going to have villains. You're still going to try to figure out ways of including these villains that existed within the normal universe, but without actually showing them, without actually recognizing the fact that these are established characters. And that's the problem. And I am not liking the idea of this. And I will say I am generally one to sit back and wait for more information, but this is, in my opinion, a horrible, horrible idea. Your guys' thoughts?
I mean, if you just look at the track record of the CW, like not even like, oh yeah, take out your thoughts initially of that one, just CW as a whole. I mean, it's not been great if we're being honest. I've seen The Flash, and I think that was probably the best one out of all the ones that I've seen from the CW. But yeah, like thinking back to Batwoman, oh my gosh, the Titans show, don't get me started on that. The Gotham, like all of them, I have thoughts obviously. But yeah, very apprehensive, very apprehensive. I agree with you that my first thought was Jason for the rebellious son, because I don't think it's going to be Dick, considering the fact that he's already in Titans. They never, ever, ever make live action shows about Tim, so it's not going to be Tim, and it doesn't sound like Damian, so that's why I think Jason too. And I agree with you. When you have a show that's somewhat about Batman, but not quite, and you don't have the character in it, it's very difficult to make it work. So yeah, very apprehensive.
Yeah, I'm right there with you guys. I mean, CW, I think as a whole, their great stuff is really good, and their not so great stuff is kind of cringeworthy sometimes. Like, I think the best CW stuff has been the first couple seasons of The Flash and the first few seasons of Arrow, but late Arrow kind of just petered out, and Flash, I haven't watched Flash in a while, but I'll probably binge it on Netflix over Christmas break, but I haven't been keeping up with any of it. Same with Supergirl. I've heard bad things about Supergirl.
Oh yeah,
Batwoman I haven't even watched because I haven't heard great things about it either. Gotham, I stopped watching Gotham. So after the beginning and this show, I mean, it's probably definitely Jason with the rebellious adopted son. That's always Jason. He's on Titans, but I guess, I mean, big part of Titans. And he's teaming up with the children of Gotham criminals. How many children these Gotham criminals is going to be? What, like Mr. Freeze Jr.? Going to be? I'd be shocked if the show ever gets made, to be honest. I mean, I can't imagine there's a lot of fan support behind it. And once the executives see that, they'll probably just tank it.
I will say it seems as if a lot of the CW shows have like a very like firm foundation when it comes to an audience. I can say in dead seriousness, I agree with the first couple seasons. At least the first 4 seasons were really good in my opinion. I think after the 5th season where the flashbacks caught up, I think that's where it kind of fell apart. The Flash, the first couple seasons were really good. That show completely fell apart once they realized Flash doesn't have a lot of really, really big bads. He just has a lot of mid-level villains that are great for like one aspect, but not a lot of big villains that you can use without it seeming like it's the same one over and over again. I did watch the first, I think 2 or 3 seasons. I think it was 2 seasons of Supergirl. I don't think it was done badly up front, but as soon as it switched over to the CW from from CBS, I think they went in a very different direction because they realized their audience was changing. It wasn't geared towards the same audience that they were trying to accomplish over on CBS. And it went for the younger crowd, which is what the CW typically aims for, which is fine. But I think that I feel like every single one of these shows, it gets to a point where they start deviating from what the source material is. And as soon as they start doing that, there's all these questions of like, but why? Why did you need to do that? And it just comes down to, well, the writers, they're trying to figure out the best way to present a TV show and think that they can do it better than the comics did. And in most cases, the most successful projects when it comes to media, movies, television, any of that stuff, it's always, if it's harkens back to the versions of the characters that you see in the comics, it does very well. There's a reason why comics last, and these villains who have been around for decades upon decades, they still are around and people still want to see stories with them. It's because the comics did it right, or at least worked out the kinks and figured out what to get rid of when it came to like rewriting history and things like that. And I can, it's a shame because I watched the first couple episodes of Batwoman, and honestly, I just ran out of time and I didn't keep up with it initially when it first aired. And eventually I'll get back into it because I do want to talk about it here on the show at some point, to kind of like a season recap or something like that. But in all honesty, like, I haven't heard very, very good things about a lot of the CW shows recently. I know Superman and Lois, the comic fans have really appreciated that. But it also is telling.
I like that one actually.
Yeah, and my understanding is that it's telling a story that's very different than what you see in the comics, and that's why it's a little bit better. Is because it kind of like gets things to a point where the comics can't focus on as much, but they can still use the characters the way they're intended to be used. And I don't see how this show is going to work. I don't want to see this show, and I hate to say that because I love seeing more and more Batman shows. Just a couple weeks ago, they announced that there was going to be, that Colin Farrell has officially signed on to do this Penguin spinoff of the Matt Reeves Batman movie. And that's the second series that's spinning out of that movie. And I'm all for that. And the reason why is because I know that the movie, if it's connected to the movie is going to make sure that the TV series gets the right budget to make it work. And that's the one thing that I think is very important for this. And if you go back probably 10 years at this point, years and years ago, or maybe it was after The Dark Knight Rises came out, the question was, well, Nolan was leaving. What do you do next with Batman? And before Zack Snyder and Batman v Superman came around, we had discussions on the TBU podcast about, well, what do you do? And I said at the time, I would love to see a high budget origin series for Batman. I want to see Bruce Wayne becoming Batman in a high budget HBO series where you can go to these locales all across the world. You can show him training, and then eventually it leads to him coming back to Gotham. And whether or not he becomes Batman in the series, or you just see him during his first year or so becoming Batman, putting the Batmobile together, doing all that stuff, getting his gadgets assembled, and kind of getting set for his fight on crime. And then it leads into the next big Batman franchise with the movie or something like that. I thought that would have been an amazing take. And they didn't go that route, but I still like the idea of having high budget HBO series that do this character justice. Because you look at what Marvel's doing, they're doing a bunch of really, really good series with characters that wouldn't necessarily be able to have a film. Not that they won't ever, but let's be honest here. Wanda or Vision were not going to be getting a standalone movie on their own based off of what we've seen in the films themselves. You could say the same thing about Falcon Winter Soldier. You could say the same thing about Loki. But those characters have now elevated just because of the quality of the series that were being put out. And now those characters are going to be popping up in future ones, or they're going to get a second season or whatever. But they were able to play around with more story elements for these characters and build them in a better way than you can in just a single movie. And this is the absolute opposite. This is not doing anything to build anything other than just create a series that is loosely connected to the Batman universe so that you can say it is somehow connected to Batman, and because of that, you should definitely take a look at it. And that's the part that I have a huge problem with. I don't like these, let's do a project that has nothing to do with any real source material, and we're just going to tell a story that does whatever that we want. It's fine when you do that in a movie, but in a series, it falls apart very, very quickly.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. I think the best movie that I've seen do that, deviate from like comic source but still land beautifully was Under the Red Hood, honestly speaking.
Yeah.
And that was just like glorious. But yeah, it like makes me like cringe just thinking about it. But okay, whatever.
You definitely need to use HBO Max as their Disney Plus with certain characters. Like I would love to see like Titan. I like Titans for the most part. They have their issues with their stuff, and I could see why other people would. But the who plays Nightwing, I would love to see him spin off to his own Nightwing show. And never heard anything about this Green Lantern show that's supposed to be coming out. I know they casted 2 people, but fandom they were silent on that. They didn't even mention that at all. So really need to take advantage of HBO Max. They use we'll have this Penguin show, we'll have the Gotham PD show, which I think if it's spinning out of the Batman, they have a lot of confidence in the Batman, and they'll have a lot of confidence in these 2 shows. So I'm excited to see those, but I'd like to see the more comic book DC stuff we can get on screen, the better. Just not making stuff up like this Gotham Knight show with one is dead and a Robin's teaming up with a bunch of criminals to clear their names and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? Maybe it could be like super amazing. You know?
Doubtful. Highly doubtful on that. I will say I will say with HBO Max, I think the problem is DC tried so hard, not DC, but Warner Brothers tried so hard to like make it happen with Justice League, and because it just didn't, they just kind of like, all right, let's accept the fact that there's multiple different versions of these characters. We'll end up explaining the multiverse in some way, which is probably going to be with the Flash film later in 2022. They'll explain the multiverse. That's how they'll have Flash on TV, and they'll tell how they'll have Flash. And I remember in 2020 DC Fandom, there was an interview that was done by Walter Hamada, the producer of the DC films now, and Jim Lee, and they were like, we understand that fans are smarter, and they understand that there can be multiple versions of these characters. And that's why I think we're getting, in some regards, almost too many projects with some of these characters. Like, let's hyper-focus on, if they have the confidence of the Matt Reeves films, let's just focus on that. Do that, and then let the universe expand from there. That's not to say you can't continuously have already what's going on with Nightwing and Titans, but there could be a Dick Grayson in the Matt Reeves universe down the line. It doesn't have to happen right this second. And TV series are a perfect way for that universe to expand without having to have a film once every 3 years or something like that. And eventually they'll figure it out. Eventually, obviously a lot of this stuff with HBO Max is in the very early stages. Disney, as much as I'm giving them props for doing what they're doing with the Marvel series, it took them almost over a year almost to get some of these series out, because they didn't have a plan in place, and it took them a while to get the plan in place, and then obviously film everything and release the stuff. So there's a lot of other stuff that's coming from Marvel on Disney Plus that I'm super looking forward to. Again, more characters that wouldn't necessarily be able to hold their own film, but you can expand them when it comes to a TV series. And there's lots of characters within the Batman universe that you could do that too. Penguin, it's not one I would immediately peg as that, but I can see why he's the one who would get the series pickup at this point based off of what we've seen, because I don't know that he's really used that much in the film, so it's a perfect character to expand outside of the film and into a TV series. All right, so with that is going to wrap up this episode. We are going to come back next week, and we've got a very special episode that's slightly holiday themed. If you like Die Hard and you say Die Hard is a Christmas movie, we've got a Batman movie that you will classify as a Christmas movie that we will be discussing next week. And then we're going to be taking a couple weeks off for the holidays, and we'll be back with more episodes after that. But in the meantime, be sure to check out our website, thebatmanuniverse.net, with all kinds of news and content related to movies, TV, merchandise, video games, and everything else related to the Bat fandom. In addition to that, we have Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, a Facebook group, Discord, YouTube. We are all over the place. Follow us, subscribe to us wherever you are seeing us. Social links can be found on our website at the top of the page when you go to thebatmanuniverse.net. If you have ideas for future episodes, obviously past the holidays, be sure to send us those at tbu@thebatmanuniverse.net. If you could take a brief moment and give us a gift for the holidays by going over to iTunes and leave us a review for our new version of the podcast. We would greatly appreciate that because it has been some time since we've had some reviews, and we're trying to get people to see our show a little bit more than the holdovers that were waiting patiently for 5 years for us to return. So we are back, and we would love other Bat fans to know that we are back too. So please share this with other Bat fans as well. With all that being said, for BJ, Hannan, and myself, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the TBU podcast. We will see you guys next time.